Hey everyone, welcome to the Secret Expert Podcast where we showcase hidden gems of experts so you and I can learn from them. Guys, I have here today Dr. Jim Canitrial. Dr. Jim, how's your day going?
Day's going good. Thanks for having me on.
And thanks for joining the podcast. And for those who do not know you, who is Dr. Jim Canitrial?
So, from a B2B perspective, I think the best way to describe myself is I help pre product market fit founders go from 0 to 1 to traction. Typically, what happens with founders who are just starting out a business, you're probably pretty lean in terms of the people that you have in place. And one of the
Mhm.
biggest challenges that you have is that you have to get validation very quickly on your product theory, your product fit, and whether it's a viable product in the marketplace. So what I do is I help those founders by integrating content, create a unified sales, marketing, partnerships, and product engine that helps them
Mhm.
go into the market effectively and go from zero, get their first batch of customers, and then from that first batch of customers, establish traction in the marketplace.
And I think your background is a very good background for a lot of people who are listening here. They can agree with this one. And you say early stage founders don't fail because they lack ideas. They fail because nothing connects. What does that look like in practice?
So in practice, what it looks like, and the reason why that happens is that a
Mhm.
lot of early stage founders are using the same playbooks that larger established organizations are using. So typically, when you see large tech organizations or large startups accelerate into the marketplace, they've already established a playbook through a year or 2 or 3 year of lessons learned. When you're an early stage founder at stage zero, you can't apply the same playbooks that those larger established firms have used. So, what you need to do is actually have an integrated way to go to market where your marketing, your sales, your partnerships, and your product all are working in unison to get to the market and establish traction. And what unfortunately happens with a lot of early stage founders is that you have disconnected elements in all of those. So, you're not building a unified message going into the market. And you're not leveraging every customer interaction that you get to be maximized. You're actually being very transactional instead of being much more relational in terms of how you take that customer through their customer journey and then maximize those conversations to feed your product, your marketing, your sales, and your partnership motions that you have in the marketplace.
And most founders, I don't know if you agree with this one, but most founders are doing content, sales, partnerships, but none of it compounds. So also when you step into a founder-led B2B startup in HR tech, tech, ed tech, or executive coaching, what's the first disconnect you usually see?
That's a good question. There's two things that I see. They don't have
Mhm.
clear content theory and they don't have a clear key or ideal customer profile built out. So, what I do is the first thing that I do is help build out who is your content for? Who is that targeting? What's the problems that they're facing with? Or what's the problems that they're dealing with that you would potentially be able to help with? If you don't define that first, you're going to have content that's all over the place. And then
Mhm.
on the customer side, that content strategy or theory that you have going forward that you talk about should also be connected to the person that you're talking to out in the wild that you want as a customer. So if your content doesn't speak to a particular audience, you're not going to bring the right people into your buyer journey and validation process. So the big mistake is having content that's too broad, doesn't specifically talk to a number of problems that your ideal customer might be dealing with, and it doesn't create the opportunity for you to have meaningful conversations beyond just the content that you're creating.
Wow, and it's like most early stage founders are busy, but they're posting content, sending outbound, taking partnership calls, but revenue still feels unpredictable. So I don't know if you also agree with with this one. So why do so many early teams treat content, sales, and partnerships as separate function instead of one GTM motion?
I don't know exactly why that happens, but I think one of the key things that you can assume is that the reason why they break those things out into different pieces instead of putting them under the same umbrella is a first things first mentality. And first things first, when you're thinking about an early stage startup, you need to get wins and you need to get wins immediately. And what happens is that obsession with wins right away actually takes the focus away from building a sustainable engine. And that's where I actually step in is that, yes, you need to win, but you also need to maximize every interaction so that it is creating a flywheel for you to create sustainable wins over the long run. So while you're focused on the short run, you need to have all of your pieces in place so that it's set up well for you
Yeah.
to build traction going forward. So when you talk about why aren't they integrating those things? It's a mindset issue where they've grown up on a playbook that first responsibility of a startup is to drive revenue. And if you're focused on that, you treat every person that you're dealing with as somebody that's going to spend money with you when that's the wrong mindset to have as an early stage startup. Anybody that is willing to have a conversation with you, you need to maximize that across their buyer journey and be able to prioritize it. And at the same time, every interaction that you have with that person needs to refine your marketing motion, needs to refine your product theory, needs to refine your partner messaging, needs to refine your sales messaging. So if you're not doing those validation and refining exercises and you're only talking about, hey, do you want to buy the product? It's a massive missed opportunity that early stage founders are subjecting themselves to.
In your overall career, is there a challenge or was there a biggest challenge that helped you have that kind of progress to tell yourself that I'm doing this, I'm doing a great job doing this?
So if I think about the way that I hear your question is
Mm.
how did I end up in this space where I'm helping other founders go to market more effectively?
Yeah, and also was there a specific challenge that you faced that helped you also to learn a new thing that up until now?
Yeah. So when I think about what I do now, it's the synthesis of what I've done throughout my career. I've always been involved in launching new products or launching new markets.
I'd say.
And what's interesting about that experience, it's essentially building something from nothing. And that's a unique skill set to have when you've done that over and over again. Now, the challenge when I was doing that throughout my career is that I didn't like the established sales playbooks that existed within the organizations that I was in. And those organizations made a lot of assumptions in terms of how you go to market and what's the messaging that's going to work in the marketplace based on the assumption that people know who you are, they know your product, they have some level of awareness of what you can deliver. That's not the case when you're an early stage founder. Nobody knows who you are, nobody knows your product, nobody cares about you. You're just noise in the ecosystem. So when you're faced with those four things, you can't go to market with the same sales playbook that an established brand goes to market with. You can't sell like Oracle sells. You can't sell
Mm,
like Adobe
yeah.
sells because people are willing to have conversations with Oracle or Adobe in the broad sense because there's some name recognition. When you're xyz.com and nobody knows what the hell you do, you're just noise. So you can't go to market with the same outbound plays that you do as an established brand. So that requires you to rise above the sea of sameness, to rise above the noise with something unique that's going to be meaningful for the person on the other end of the email or the call. And that's really the mindset shift that I help early stage founders overcome and adopt in their environments, because that's actually what's going to get them to traction is having more conversations and more meaningful conversations at that stage of their development so that they can quickly identify what's the right path, what's the right messaging, what's the right product mix that we need to have in
I
order
see.
to build a customer base.
Well, and you've also helped founders build multi-million dollar pipelines from zero. What actually creates pipeline at that stage? Activity or maybe alignment or other factors?
Everything that you do should be with an eye towards creating pipeline. The
Mm,
problem is that you're at an early stage. You don't necessarily know what you're looking for in terms of the type of customer. So I help actually
yeah.
build those refinement engines on the fly. What does an ideal customer look like? And how does that show up in the conversations? What should we be validating throughout the process? I think the big thing that I help founders with is shift their mindset for how they view discovery in the selling process. So in a
Mm,
more mature sales organization, the discovery stage is a stage. And I actually am always an advocate for you need to look at discovery as a process versus a stage. So every interaction that you have with a customer You need to be uncovering something about their problems, something about their needs in the marketplace, something about their view of your competitors. And that needs to be an ongoing process. And you work through their buying journey by engaging in that process orientation. So that actually leads you to build pipeline. Unfortunately, when you're an early stage founder, what typically happens is that you're thinking more or less on how many booked demos can I get. You need to have a piece of your outbound motion that targets that. But here's the problem. When you don't have your product validated, when you don't have your problem validated, when you haven't had enough customers or potential customers say, these are the problems that we deal with, this is how I would look at your product and what it solves. You have no idea in terms of what your messaging should be. So you can't even go outbound on something like that because you haven't had that stuff, the problem statements validated. So it's that ongoing validation, ongoing discovery, and ongoing engagement of a potential buyer that actually helps get you quicker to pipeline. And that's how it's when I talk about integrating marketing, sales, partnerships, and product, that's all a function of that single unified motion in the marketplace.
In that early stage, I think also there's still brand gravity and there's still inbound machine and everything has to be intentional. Like the things that you need to know your market and also a lot of things that can decide this factor. So also I want to know, how do you help founders define ICP and product market fit while actively selling instead of waiting for clarity to maybe happen?
So that's a good question. What I actually do is that you're building your sales motion on the fly, you're building your ICP on the fly, and you're building product market fit
Yeah.
on the fly. And what that means is at that stage, you can't disqualify too quickly. You don't know enough to
Mm.
do that. What you need is a critical mass of conversation so that you can validate all of those things. So, what that actually looks like in practice is that every engagement that you have with a potential prospect, and remember, this is embedded with content into that motion, is a learning opportunity for you to uncover something about what they're going through and connect the dots between what they're going through and some of the potential things that you solve. Ultimately, you want to apply some research components into it. And one of the core rules that I let early stage founders know about is that you have to be committed to making sure that every person that enters your ecosystem sees your product. So whether we're talking about a service-based business or a product-based business, they need to get an experience of your product in some way, shape, or form so that they can get eyes on it and then give you feedback on it. If you're eliminating that feedback step, you're going to have a lot of problems in terms of identifying who your ICP is, because if you never get to the point of asking, when you see this, what comes to mind? How could this impact your environment? You need to ask those questions from a product perspective to
Mhm.
understand how your product is actually landing and who it's landing for. Now, part of that exercise involves validating your theory about who your ICP should be. I often work in HR tech and TA tech, ed tech, and then executive coaching. So I know my lanes in terms of who my customers are. And the clients that I work for sell into the personas that would typically buy those services. So I have an idea there. But if you don't even have an idea of what space should you be operating, the way that you should segment your outbound is to run experiments on different segments or personas that you want to sell into and have your content be structured in a way that all of those personas can speak to it, and then measure which one of those personas is moving the furthest in terms of the deal cycle. And then once you get your first handful of wins, now you have a much tighter idea of who your ICP is. You need to do a win analysis that tells you what's happening behind the scenes. And then you actually dive deep into industry and different things like that, that allows you to accelerate into a particular niche.
And how can content earn credibility instead of just attention? Because I think a lot of people would commonly have a misconception about this.
So it depends on how you structure your content. So one
Mm.
of the things that I often see from a founder perspective is that their content has no unifying or underlying theory behind it. You haven't defined your content pillars. You haven't defined any of your problem statements that you want to validate. So it's just a general talking head format. What I immediately do when I typically encourage organizations to embed content into all aspects of their outbound at that early stage is that you need to think deeply about who your ideal listener or consumer is. and also who your ideal prospect is that you want to bring into your ecosystem. And you need to be able to talk to the problems that they're facing. So if you're not saying those things
Mm,
out loud, you're going to have leakage in terms of your audience, and you're going to have leakage in terms of your ICP, and that's not going to get you traction. So when you're talking about content that lands and making sure that it's building credibility, you have to take a position and stand for any number of things, but you certainly need to lead with the problem that audience faces. And that's a way for you to build credibility. The other piece of it that I always talk about is if you're structuring content and the only person actually saying and doing things is just you, it's going to get legs, but it's not going to have as much impact as if you bring other people on who are in the space that can share their best practices. So I'm big on collaboration when it comes to content, especially when you're talking about founder led sales. You need to be collaborating with who your ideal customer is or who your ideal prospect you think might be your ideal prospect, and bring them into the conversation to have them share their best practices. Because if you
mm.
don't do that, you're not going to get as much reach as you would and as much credibility unless you're one of those people that are like independently known in your space. You always want to lean on the expertise of those that are in your audience, and that's going to help you go much further.
Wow. So for our last section of the podcast, or for the last question, if a founder listening today feels stuck pre or post revenue, what's the first thing they should stop doing?
Wow, that's a good question. I think if they're stuck, the first thing that I would say that they should probably look at doing is taking a zoom out and look at all the different channels that you have activity. What are all of your different channels that you generate pipeline from? And then look at which channel is most productive. However you define it, which channel is most productive. And once you identify that most productive channel, double and
Mhm.
triple down there and probably eliminate the ones that aren't working or aren't as consistent. I think one of the things that I see quite often is that founders are spread too thin across too many different channels and don't focus on a single channel or a handful of channels that are highly likely to be productive. And then you need to be disciplined over time. So there's two problems
Mm,
that exist. You're spread out too thin across multiple channels, and or you don't spend enough time in the right channels for long enough for that to pay off. When I talk about embedding content into your outbound and using that as a unifier across your revenue engine, it's not something that gets fixed in a month and a half, especially when you're talking about you don't have a structured sales process, you don't have a structured outbound process, you haven't validated your product or your problem statements. You're doing that on the fly. So to expect to do that in 45 days, it's unrealistic.
mm.
So those are the two things that I often see that leads to a broken funnel or founders getting stuck.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Jim. This has been a practical and grounded conversation with you. What stands out is your focus on alignment over activity and execution over theory. So, founders listening, this isn't about doing more. It's about making what you already are doing or doing actually connect. So, thanks for sharing your perspective. Again, before we end this podcast, do you want maybe to promote your service, or you want to promote or share anything that you'd like?
Yeah, if you're stuck, I'm happy to have a conversation. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm assuming you drop that in the show
Yeah.
notes. So just connect with me there. When you do message me, if you have questions, just reference where you saw this, and then that will help me connect the dots. I don't generally accept blind connection requests.
Man. Thank you so much again, Dr. Jim. I hope you had a wonderful time with us.
Yeah, nice hanging out. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks. Thanks for attending the podcast. And guys, if you're new to the channel, please share and subscribe. And I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much, Dr.